Okay, guys, here we go with our very last period of APUSH. Unbelievable. Who thought we would make it? Nevertheless, this is a very short period because obviously it's the most recent, and we'll talk more about the AP exam, in live streams and stuff, but this won't be quite as necessary for the actual AP exam as periods 3 through 7. So we don't need to spend as much time on it, which is good. But also, it's only 3 chapters in your book. So I'm going to try to get through this material as quick as possible so that we have as much time to review as possible. And that might mean that some of these notes videos might go a little bit longer than usual. So just bear with me. I'm going to try and crank out this entire period in 5 days or something very close to 5 days. So we'll see how it goes. So when we ended period 8, that was right at the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency. So it's important to talk about why periods 8 and 9 divide where they do. And it's not, it could have also been an easy choice to sort of divide them, just say like, 1970, that's where we'll call it, or 1990 is more current. But there's definitely a difference in what's happening in the United States between Jimmy Carter's presidency and then in all of the years after that. In the late 70s, we're sort of beginning to wind down this era of constant social change. All of these different activist groups some of them are starting to fizzle out, others are just starting to become less active, and they're starting to get less and less media attention. And so that is allowing sort of this new period to take place and to grab hold. So this is this next period of time is gonna be dominated by a rise in conservatism and political conservatism. This is gonna be a very good era for the Republican Party in terms of power, and that's for several reasons. And it will all sort of come together in this perfect storm to allow Ronald Reagan to get elected in 1980. So the first main reason why we're going to see this rise in conservatism is because of the liberal power structure that was in place through parts of the 1970s and before. If you're looking at our most recent presidents who were Democrats, you're talking about Kennedy, Johnson, and Jimmy Carter. And not really any of them, other than maybe Kennedy, but he was only president for a short time, ended their terms with the American people happy with them. We know that the liberals and the Democrats of the 70s in general were in favor of more government intervention. They felt that the government should play a significant role in improving the lives of all Americans. They valued social programs to help the elderly, the poor, the unemployed, like LBJ's Great Society. They sponsored laws to benefit minorities, like affirmative action. They favored government regulation of industry and business. They wanted to cooperate with international governmental organizations like the UN. That was their party line. Now compare that to the Republicans' party line. They feel that a strong central government can endanger economic growth and individual choice. They feel that the liberal spending policies, like we saw through those 3 presidents I mentioned in the 60s and 70s, have left us with a rising inflation rate and far too much waste. They often criticize liberals for just throwing money at a problem to solve it. Like if you see like the poor, the elderly, and the unemployed that I mentioned that they wanted to support with social programs, there often the conservative argument is that just throwing money at the problem is not going to solve it. You need to think through a better solution. That was a common critique at the time. The hardcore and sort of I guess you would say like central groups within the Republican Party that are going to remain strong are like the neocons. And neo, we know, means new, and con means conservative, but neocon is not a new conservative. It's actually kind of an old conservative. Neocons are like traditionalists. George W. Bush was a neocon, for example. But the neocons were starting to become a more popular piece of the Republican Party. They warned about abandoning traditional values. They talked a lot about the declining quality of our youth at the time. That was a big conversation, and a lot of this, and a lot of them also like coincided their political beliefs with their religious beliefs. And I'll get to the religious aspect of all of this in a minute. But the other really strong piece of the Republican Party is anti-communism, which was really, has been a major topic of conversation since the war ended, since World War II ended. These people fought against the SALT II treaty and other more relaxed initiatives that involved the Soviet Union because they wanted sort of like a strong front line against communism. And in the 1940s and 50s, conservatives and liberals, while I've just explained their platforms essentially were very different, they worked very well together. Bipartisanship was extremely common. When you look at the presidencies of like FDR and even Eisenhower, in terms of political situations, there was far less drama. And that's really because both of those presidents had good relationships with, overall, good relationships with people in Congress on both sides of the aisle. And it worked well for them. And that's one of the reasons why people trusted their government, is because they didn't see, you see your parents arguing, you start to wonder, like, what's going on? That's kind of what happens with the government. If you see them constantly bickering with each other, people are like, man, they don't know what they're doing any more than we do. Why are we letting them make these major decisions? And so through the 1960s and 70s, which was a very divisive time period, like you wrote about in your SAQ on your test, we see the division between liberals and conservatives continue to grow, and they played into their counter base by just attacking the other side and refusing to cooperate, which makes it so much harder to get things done. And I'm sure this sounds familiar because we're in a similar situation, or not quite as much during the pandemic, but we've been in a similar situation over the last few years. So in the late 1970s, when Jimmy Carter's presidency was happening to all of us, people were largely unhappy, even a lot of the people that had voted for Jimmy Carter. And we'll start to see what happens as something we call the new right begin to evolve in the late 70s. And we'll see this major resurgence of the conservative movement. Liberalism is losing its appeal for several reasons. One, because of all of this economic decline. We're still dealing with stagflation, and no one's been able to provide any real solution to it, and a lot of it is being blamed on the mistakes of liberal leadership in the 1960s. And a lot of people are looking at Jimmy Carter like, hey man, you haven't done anything to fix it at all. On top of that, people were very unhappy with the way that our foreign policy issues were beginning to go. We know that people weren't necessarily pleased with Vietnam, but we're starting to get over that. Now we're looking at the foreign policy flubs of the Carter administration. It just looks like we're continuously seeing the same mistakes. Too much spending on social, or according to a lot of people, too much spending on social programs, government regulations allowing foreign competition to hurt American businesses and industry, and something called unfunded mandates, which was starting to become a lot more popular in the late 70s, which is basically where the government will require something like a certain social program, but they won't pay for it. They'll demand states pay for it, or states will pass it and they'll demand that counties pay for it. So, for example, when the state of North Carolina passed a law saying limiting elementary school class sizes to a maximum of 25, which was great. Everybody wants to keep class sizes small. It's always better for the learner and for the teacher. but they did not put any money aside to hire more teachers and build more schools so that we could decrease class sizes. So what ends up happening is the counties have to rearrange their funds, which makes they start moving, putting more energy into hiring teachers at the elementary level and less teachers at the high school level. So you get classrooms in high school and middle school that have like 40 people in them. So you're just moving the problem sort of up the age bracket. And that's just one example of an unfunded mandate. There are, dozens and dozens, but that was starting to become a lot more common in a way for the federal government to pass social programs, but not have to increase their spending. They would pass these unfunded mandates, but people were realizing that that's really a scam in itself. It's just a bill. Here's the thing you have to do and you have to pay for it, and there's no way around it. Another group that's going to start to lean towards this conservative side is a group called the Sagebrush Rebels, which are people who live in predominantly Western states. If you look at the map on the slide there, if you see everywhere there's color is federally owned land. And so the darkest parts, the red, that's where there's the most federally owned land. And a lot of the people in these states wanted their states and local governments to have control of more of that land. They wanted the federal government to turn over some of that land so that the states could use it for economic development. And they're largely going to be criticized by environmentalists, which is going to continue to divide those liberals, that liberal side and that conservative side. And the last major piece of this puzzle is a group called the moral majority, which is the religious and evangelical aspect of all of this, which is really going to be the temporary nail in the coffin for the Democratic Party. They're one of the reasons Jimmy Carter got elected, and then, his term in office didn't go so great in the eyes of a lot of people, and so they left the Democrats behind, and moved over to the Republicans, and they have pretty much remained with the Republicans ever since, aside from sort of a brief trip to the Tea Party in the maybe 10 years ago or so. But for the most part, that's where they've stayed since. So we call them the moral majority. That is an actual group. The moral majority was a group founded by a televangelist named Jerry Falwell, and that's him on the cover of Time magazine there. If you remember, when I was talking about Carter's election, I mentioned that televangelists were preachers on TV like Joel Osteen, or people like that. But he had millions of viewers, and he spoke a lot about fixing the decline of the American family. And this is something that a lot of that silent majority group that Nixon catered to so much, that's one of the major pieces one of the major concerns that they have when they're going to vote in November of 1980 is, think about all of the things that happened in the 1960s and 70s. Like, that's just 20 years worth of time. And it has been full of chaos and change, and a lot of good change, but not everyone sees all change as good change. I'm sure they probably saw some of this change as good change, but overwhelmingly most people are over it. They're like, okay, we had the change. I'm tired of this. I want to get back to what they see as normal life. They want to return to normalcy. And that's really something that Jerry Falwell was telling people the Republican Party was going to give them. The moral majority is going to use their, power structure in numbers to carry a lot of political weight. They opposed, more liberal Supreme Court decisions like Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion, or Ingle v. Vitale, which stopped mandated prayer in schools. They condemned the ERA. Phyllis Schlafly was a very strong member of the moral majority, and they were strong opponents of the gay rights and gay lib movement. By 1980, this group was only founded in the late 70s, but by 1980, they had over 2 million members who were registered voters. And Jerry Falwell is going to use that. If you are a presidential candidate, this is a guy you want on your side. He has 2 million votes that he can give you. If he gets on TV and says, this is who God is telling us to support, and vote with your religious beliefs, and this is the person who they align with, then that's going to be a big a big thing in your corner that you can use to get that win in November. So on top of that, the South is starting to lean back towards Republicans again, thanks to, Jimmy Carter not necessarily doing so hot, and they're going back to, that Southern strategy that Nixon had used. And over time, we know more and more people have continued to move to the Sun Belt and into the suburbs of the South, which is going to benefit the Republican Party because now the South has more votes than ever. They have more electoral votes than ever, more political power than ever, and it's really going to come in handy for them. So all of these things combined are going to come together in November of 1980 to bring about the election of Ronald Reagan. So Reagan, a little background on him, he was originally from Illinois. He became an actor. He lived in California, in Hollywood, acting for quite a while. After his career began to slow down, he became a spokesman for GE, for General Electric. This is in like the 50s and 60s, and he went on speaking tours, and people realized like he was an excellent speaker. Not, just because you're an actor doesn't mean that you're a great speaker, but he was a fantastic speech giver. He really connected with people and made people listen, and he had a great tone and mannerisms, and people loved to watch Reagan speak. And he got more involved with the conservative side of politics at the time. He became what we call a Goldwater conservative, who supported Barry Goldwater at the time when he ran for president against Johnson in 1964. Remember, that was the campaign that Hillary Clinton worked on when she was young, the Goldwater campaign. And he went on tours for Barry Goldwater and talked about how government regulation of business and industry was hurting the economy. And he talked a lot about the dangers of communism. He got very involved with the Goldwater campaign and won the respect of a lot of conservatives. And even though Barry Goldwater didn't win, the Republican Party and the establishment of that group really saw Ronald Reagan as a rising star. And they were like, hey, let's put this guy in somewhere. So he decides, and they basically convince him to run for governor of California in 1966. He wins and was governor for several terms. And then in 1980, they're looking for, the person to sort of lead them out of the trauma of the Nixon, who was the last Republican president. We haven't had a Republican, before Nixon besides Eisenhower. So it's been quite a while. We haven't had a lot of Republican presidents in this, mid 20th century era. So looking for someone who can, bring home the win. And they thought that Reagan was that. So the election time comes. Carter's pretty much, don't get me wrong, love and respect the human being that is Jimmy Carter, but in terms of president, kind of a dingus, and people knew it, and it was really killing the Democratic Party. And something that Reagan would do a lot in his rallies and speeches he would say to people, think about it. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? If the answer is no, then you don't need to vote the way that you did 4 years ago. It's time to vote for change. And people were like, wow, no, I'm not better off now than I was 4 years ago. The economy is continuously in decline. What is the state of world affairs? Because the last 4 years of the 70s were not a great time period. And so it was a smart point to bring up, and it really worked for a lot of people. In general, the race was pretty tight until the end. And at the end is when they had their one and only debate. They only had one debate in 1980. And like I said, Reagan was incredible speaker, and he was a very good communicator, and it showed clearly in the debate, and Jimmy Carter really just couldn't hold his own. So when it came time for the vote, the popular vote close, the electoral vote not at all. It was 489 to 49. You can see there on the map. At least Carter did carry his home state of Georgia, but that's about it. So now, and not only did the Republicans won the White House in 1980, they also won the Senate for the first time since 1955. The House of Representatives will remain under the control of the Democratic Party. So now we're going to basically see like a forcing of bipartisan cooperation, because we've got Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other. Both houses have to agree to get things done. So we're going to have to see some people starting to work together, unlike the last 20 years or so. So we consider, and a lot of historians call what's about to happen here the Reagan Revolution, and it really is several different things. But the main thing when they talk about the Reagan Revolution is two things. One, that conservative new right that has emerged. That was one piece that was sort of so revolutionary that brought this. But the other is a change in how we're going to handle economics, and a lot, it gets this nickname Reaganomics, but I guess you would say like the real name is supply side economics. A lot of people's one of their top issues that they were voting on when they went to go vote in November was the economy. We're still dealing with stagflation and the oil crisis and all these other things. So a lot of people wanted to see someone take some effective action against our current economic crisis, and they thought that supply side economics would be the solution. So essentially the logic behind supply side economics is if taxes are reduced, you are increasing the people's income. Now if my taxes get reduced, yes, my income goes up, but not a whole lot, because I don't make a whole lot of money, so I'm not paying a whole lot of money in taxes. So if you cut my taxes, like, yeah, I'm probably just gonna spend a little more. I might, upgrade my car and take on a larger car payment. But in general, I'm not gonna bring massive economic relief to what is becoming like a national crisis. Um, but if you cut the tax, this is, they're thinking, you cut the taxes of people who pay the most taxes, which is the upper class, large businesses and business owners, then they are going to have a lot more money, and they're going to spend more money, and they'll invest in new businesses and loans and things like that. And it will help the economy grow. And then in turn, the government will collect more taxes on that revenue. And so it will all even out. So he wanted to cut taxes dramatically and balance the budget at the same time. So if you cut your income and you want to balance the budget, you got to cut your spending. So he's going to cut a lot of government programs at the same time. So we will pass the Economic Recovery Act in 1981, which will reduce taxes by 25% over 3 years. And the Americans at the top who paid the most taxes got the largest tax cut. Like I said, wealthy people spend their money differently than me and you. They invest in business, which employs more people and stimulates the economy more. That's the thought process here. And by cutting taxes by 25%, like I said, you got to cut things off the budget. So Reagan's going to cut $40 billion off of the federal budget to keep things balanced. He called a lot for deregulation, and by the mid 80s, he had accomplished a lot of it. They had deregulated the airlines, telecommunications, and banking. The deregulation of banking, though, is definitely going to come back to bite us, but it's going to take 30 years. It won't be really until 2008 when we see the market crash, the worst time really since the Great Depression, that we'll see why all that deregulation of banking wasn't necessarily the best idea. Starting in 1980, when Jimmy Carter was still president, we hit another recession. So because we hit that recession so early, even before Reagan was in office, it was important that there be quick action taken. So for the first year, really until 1982, at that point he had only been president for like a year, we were under the severe recession. Unemployment was up a little more than sorry, I'm going to rephrase that. I'm realizing that it would sound weird if I had said it the way I was going to. It was up to a little more than 10%. I was going to say it almost went up by 10%, but that's not true. It was up a little above 10% as our total unemployment rate. And it hit blue collar workers the hardest, as it almost always does. So the people at the bottom always, feeling the most whenever we hit a crisis like this. And a lot of this particular economic crisis was caused by those policies of Jimmy Carter and Paul Volcker. Remember, he nominated Paul Volcker as the head of the Federal Reserve, who put in place these really strong interest rates. But unfortunately, they were left in place for too long, and it then causes an economic crisis. So by 1983, though, Reagan's policies had started to actually kick in, and things got better. Supply side economics is not a quick fix. It's not going to be something that people feel immediately. It takes time, and it took really, a year and a half, 2 years to see it working. But ultimately, inflation began to fall. Our gross national product began to rise, showing the success of American businesses. But even though overall things are getting better, the amount of people in poverty is increasing at the same time, because we're seeing this massive amount of immigration coming in from Latin America, and most of those people fall below the poverty line. And there was really no major effort by anyone in Washington to help that category of people. Immigrants are going to stay on the back burner for everyone for quite some time. So because of all of this, reduction in spending, it's going to lead to a few other issues. One of Reagan's major goals was to end the Cold War, and I'll talk more about that in another video, but that's going to cause him to increase defense spending. And so unfortunately, though, with the rise in spending on defense budget that he had, he wasn't able to get the other budget cuts to balance it out from Congress. So while he set out with that goal, they weren't able to close the deal, and so it will cause our national debt to rise to about 2.5 trillion, a drop in the bucket compared to where we're sitting today, but at the time was extremely high, and they were worried about what that might do. So in 1985, they passed a law called the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act, named after the three congressmen who wrote it: Gramm, Rudman, and Hollings. So the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act basically institutes a debt ceiling. And if you've paid attention to the news over the last, 10 years, you've probably heard a lot of conversations about the debt ceiling, because we've hit it like seven times. And every time the government gets shut down, it's usually because of the debt ceiling. And what this basically does, though, is it says that our budget has to be balanced by 1990. And if it isn't, then automatic budget cuts would kick in. And if the debt gets too high, then automatic budget cuts would kick in. They will balance the budget in 1990. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure that was the last time they did. It's now 2020. It's been quite a while, 30 years. Pretty sure we haven't balanced the budget since. So, towards the end of Reagan's, really at the end of Reagan's presidency, we will see one other economic crisis in 1989. This was right after he ended his second term, when George Herbert Walker Bush took office. This was called the Savings and Loan Crisis of 1989. Around 1,000 savings and loans banks are going to fail in the late 80s because of, we see that, deregulation. We know from the progressive era, from Teddy Roosevelt, when you let these businesses and banks do whatever they want, they don't always do the right thing. And so we'll start, and like I said, we'll see that hardcore in 2008, but we'll see it a little bit here in 1989. A lot of fraudulent behavior, risky loans, cost a lot of these banks everything they had. And in order to prevent the problem from getting worse, the government voted to institute a bailout of these banks. So they're going to spend over $200 billion in bailouts for these failed banks, but while making no true effort to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so because of that, the same mistakes will occur by 2008, and we'll end up in the same situation. Overwhelmingly, people felt good about Reagan's policy through his first term. He got a strong re-election in 1984. He continued to, push that conservative movement through. He nominated several conservative judges, including Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first female justice on the Supreme Court. And his popularity at the end of 1988 is really what allowed him to get his vice president, George Bush Sr., elected and inaugurated in office by 1989.